Today, I want to talk to everyone about the US-China trade agreement, which is expected to reduce tariffs on goods worth $30 billion each. In addition, China has come to the US seeking reconciliation, but if you don't loosen your stance on Taiwan, China has no need to buy 500 Boeing planes. US President Trump has concluded his visit to China. There is no doubt that China and the US are now the two real global powers, the so-called G2. The interactions between China and the US dominate the fate of the world. China's attitude toward the US is, if you want to talk, you're welcome. If you want to fight, that's fine too. In the end, Trump requested to visit China, fully opening the door to dialogue and negotiations between the two countries. The first key point is that China has completely taken the initiative in defining the US-China relationship. The new description agreed upon by China and the US is to position their relationship as a constructive and strategically stable partnership. This relationship includes positive stability centered on cooperation, healthy stability with measured competition, normal stability with controllable differences, and lasting stability with the prospect of peace. In short, although there is competition between the two countries, stability should be the main focus, avoiding the Thucydides trap, in other words, preventing the two countries from going to war. Professor Cui Hongjian from Beijing Foreign Studies University believes that for a long time, due to the lack of a clear definition of China-US relations, the US side has often interpreted the relationship arbitrarily and without restraint. Now, this new definition will have a significant impact on both policy and behavioral concepts. Among these, the mention of constructiveness is a response to China's insistence that the direction of US policy should be to avoid conflict and confrontation and to move forward together. Second, strategic reflects both countries' full recognition of the importance of China-US relations. China-US relations have already become the main axis of current international relations, and many countries take changes in China-US relations as the starting point for formulating their foreign policies. Third, constructiveness and strategic orientation ultimately point toward stability. Stability means peace, which is conducive to China and the US, moving from peaceful coexistence toward a more predictable relationship, and then seeking possible opportunities for cooperation. With this guidance from the leaders of China and the US, the development of China-US relations now has a clear direction and constraints, which helps prevent the relationship from fluctuating or regressing. It can be understood this way: China sees Trump as a businessman who, after realizing he can't defeat China, is intentionally seeking to improve relations and do some business with China. However, due to the rampant anti-China forces within the United States, even within the Republican Party, there are many anti-China voices. The US has been engaging in various small moves against China. In response, China is working to establish a constructive, strategic, and stable relationship between China and the US. In the future, whenever someone in the US political sphere crosses the line, China can immediately demand that the US take action to restrain them. From the US perspective, acknowledging this kind of China-US relationship is also a significant concession, as it clearly signals that the US will no longer seek confrontation with China. When interviewed by Fox News, US State Department's Marco Rubio said that since China is the greatest geopolitical challenge facing the United States, it is also the most important relationship that the US must manage properly. He believes that China has always had its own plan, is confident it will become the world's most powerful country and surpass the United States, and that China is carrying out this plan. There is nothing wrong with this as long as China's rise does not come at the expense of the United States. Rubio's statement is tantamount to acknowledging that the United States will no longer make containing China's rise its national policy. Second, mutual exchange of interests. China's main focus is the Taiwan issue, and ideally, Trump would personally state his opposition to Taiwan independence. Of course, a reduction in US arms sales to Taiwan is also a substantive issue. Trump was clearly embarrassed by the Taiwan issue. The next day, when he visited the Temple of Heaven and was repeatedly questioned by reporters about his stance on the Taiwan issue, he simply responded by saying that the Temple of Heaven was truly beautiful. When Marco Rubio was interviewed, he also avoided giving a direct answer. He only mentioned that China wants to unify with Taiwan, but he believes that what China wants most is for Taiwan to voluntarily unify with China in a perfect world. China hopes that, at the right moment, Taiwan can hold a referendum to return to China. Rubio used a rhetorical technique, saying things that China would not deny in order to avoid making a clear statement on the Taiwan issue. He merely claimed that the US policy toward Taiwan had not changed, and that what the US wanted was for China to make large purchases of American goods, such as buying 500 Boeing airplanes. In the end, Trump revealed that China agreed to buy 200 Boeing airplanes. He also claimed that Boeing actually only wanted to sell 150 planes, but China ended up buying 200. But this kind of rhetoric clearly can't fool the market. In fact, Boeing wanted to sell 500 planes, but only managed to sell 200. After the news broke, Boeing's stock price fell by nearly 5%. The market was clearly disappointed by China's purchase order. The US and China are still locked in a constant struggle over trade issues. Since you are also unwilling to make a clearer statement on the Taiwan issue, China will not be giving out any bigger peaches either. Third, substantive doubts. Trump's China visit recalls Nixon's 1972 trip. During the Cold War, US-China ties were strained, but Nixon sought reconciliation, aiming for a joint front to pressure the Soviet Union. At that time, I was just a child, watching television and seeing the US and China loudly insulting each other. The US wanted to completely contain this Red China, while China fiercely denounced the US as imperialists. But after a while, I saw Nixon go to Beijing to meet Chairman Mao. Even as a little kid, I understood that diplomacy is just that pragmatic. Even mortal enemies can find room to cooperate. Today, China still doesn't want to accept the feeling of having its fate decided by two superpowers, and refuses to acknowledge that China and the US are the G2, the world's two major powers. But this de facto G2 situation can no longer be changed. The EU has crippled itself, and Russia has been bogged down by the war in Ukraine. Indeed, only China and the US can call the shots now. When China and the US ease tensions, the world is stable. When China and the US confront each other, the world is shaken. Easing tensions between China and the US is a historical choice for both countries, especially for the United States. Trump adopted a very humble posture during his visit to China. If you look at how he humiliated leaders from around the world at the White House, you'll understand just how modest he was when he went to Beijing. Of course, anti-China individuals felt quite uncomfortable seeing this scene, so they kept bringing up President Xi shaking hands and talking with Marco Rubio, repeatedly saying that China couldn't do anything to this person it had sanctioned. In fact, China's view is quite pragmatic. When you were a senator and acted against China, of course I sanctioned you. But now that you're wearing the hat of US Secretary of State and coming to China to seek reconciliation, I'll still let you come. But if one day you take off the Secretary of State's hat and become an anti-China figure again, China can always step up its sanctions against you. If you've seen Chairman Mao shake hands with you before, you'd know that what you're seeing now is really nothing special. These self-congratulatory comments from anti-China individuals are just self-deception. The reality is that even the proud President of the United States doesn't dare offend China and has to visit Beijing with great humility. When Air Force One left Beijing, it didn't take Jimmy Lai with it. The hope that anti-China figures have for the US to rescue them will ultimately be in vain, because the US only cares about its own interests. In the eyes of the United States, these people are just disposable pawns. To put it bluntly, if China buys 100 more Boeing planes and arrests a few more reactionaries, the US wouldn't have any objections at all. Let's also talk about what kind of trade agreements China and the US have reached. What can be said now is that the US is doing most of the talking, while the Chinese side is saying relatively little. Trump himself was the first to make statements, claiming that China had agreed to buy 200 Boeing planes. The US Treasury Secretary Besson, who accompanied Trump on his visit to China, said in an interview that China and the US would explore setting up a trade committee responsible for bilateral trade affairs. In addition, they would also establish an investment committee specifically for non-sensitive areas to handle investments between the two countries. China and the US will also discuss establishing guardrails for artificial intelligence to prevent these innovative achievements from falling into the hands of criminals. Greer, the US trade representative, who was also part of the delegation, told Bloomberg in an interview that after the expected meeting between the Chinese and US leaders, China would sign agreements to purchase billions of dollars worth of agricultural products. He said that last October, China reached an agreement with the US to purchase 25 million tons of soybeans annually, and with this visit, another agreement was reached for China to buy tens of billions of dollars worth of agricultural products over the next 3 years. Not just soybeans, but all other agricultural products as well. And Trump himself also said that China has already agreed to purchase oil from the United States, and that we will begin sending Chinese ships to Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska to transport the oil. When it comes to energy, China has an insatiable appetite, while the United States has unlimited energy resources. Listening to US officials, it sounds like China is buying American airplanes, American soybeans, and American energy. In reality, they are just choosing to talk about things that are advantageous to themselves, making it seem as if China has made a lot of unilateral commitments. The key point is the soon-to-be-established China-US Trade Commission. According to earlier reports, within the framework of the Trade Commission, it is said that both China and the US will each designate $30 billion worth of goods and mutually exempt each other's tariffs. After Trump took office last year, he first imposed a 10% divergence tariff and a 10% reciprocal tariff on China, which have not yet been lifted. And in April last year, China also took precise countermeasures, imposing a 15% tariff on US energy and a 10% tariff on US agricultural products. China's stance is very straightforward. Since you are still keeping the divergence tariffs, I will continue to impose additional tariffs on your agricultural products and energy. With your goods being so expensive, Chinese consumers simply can't afford to buy them. If both sides mutually exempt each other's tariffs, China could buy more American goods. It is estimated that China and the US will each exempt about $30 billion worth of US energy and agricultural products from the additional 10% to 15% tariffs, while the US will correspondingly reduce the 10% divergence tariffs on $30 billion worth of Chinese goods. It is expected that the trade agreement will be mutually beneficial rather than the US unilaterally reducing taxes on its products and selling them to China. The final conclusion is that the world has changed. After 100 years of trade war between China and the US, China has used a tough stance and hard power to force the US to come to China to seek reconciliation. And when Trump left, he still loudly praised the visit, saying it was truly incredible and that he had achieved many important results. I believe that after watching this Trump visit, the people who feel the most unhappy are those anti-China individuals.